first of all, I want to thank the Rubenstein School and the Gund Institute, and particularly Ida and Bob for inviting us both here to give lectures. I'm really excited about the Solutions Journal, and I hope to be involved in some of that. It's something that I think is long overdue. The other thing I want to do to just set a bit of context is Bob gave me that very nice introduction, but what he failed to say is a lot of this was probably hastened by a midlife crisis in which I had been a traditional designer for 30 years and was running a fairly large design firm that had offices, that had offices in San Francisco and Berlin and London and Zurich. And we were working for lots of big clients all over the world. And I began to see that the work I was doing was actually implicated in more and more of the big problems I saw out in the world, and it didn't feel to me like it was contributing to their solution in hardly any way. So I left my company in 2001 with the idea that I was either going to find another way to make a living that was more connected to solutions and less connected to problems, or I was going to have to learn to design differently. So through a series of circumstances that's a story for another day, I ended up going to Schumacher College, a Center for Ecological Studies, and doing a degree in holistic science. And what I thought was, at my age, I had so many bad habits to break that it was going to take a long time for me to begin to shift the way I thought in order to design differently. So it's important to remember that the context I'm speaking out of today is very definitely what I would call the traditional design disciplines. And I'll talk more about that later, but it's not what I think we all consider to be ecological design. I was trained as a designer, and a lot of the issues and the problems that I'll be talking about today pertain to those traditional design disciplines. Yeah. So I love this quote by David Orr. As Homo sapiens' entry into any intergalactic design competition, industrial civilization would be thrown out in the qualifying round. I mean, I think that pretty much says it all, and you could collect almost any picture of the built world that would substantiate that claim. The world we live in today is much more a man-made world or artificial world than a natural world. Almost every element in our environment shows evidence of man's artifice, or so claimed Herbert Simon in The Sciences of the Artificial. That's a real photograph of a housing development in Mexico City. So at the heart of what I've been thinking about lately is what the heck is in our heads that makes us design that way? The problem is that our artifices are endangering the survival of all life on the planet. And the artificial world is the designed world. Almost everywhere we look, we see the work of designers. You can't look anywhere without seeing something that somebody conceived in their head, developed through a sketch, and then they had to go, that's it. That's the solution right there. Every Java jacket, every impossibly stylish fashion accessory, every Hello Kitty exhaust pipe was conceived and designed by someone. There are legions of us traditional designers out there, and very few are interested in design for sustainability, which I view as a tremendous liability for society that also contains within it enormous potential for change. So this is what I mean when I talk about the design disciplines. I've been teaching at the university level for about 25 years now. And most of the universities and programs I teach in, you know, the landscape looks about like this. I myself spent about 25 years trying to master just a few of the sub-disciplines within my sub-discipline. And it amounts to kind of doing this. Oh, typography. Oh gosh, here I am. And before long, you're looking down like this, and you don't see any connections anymore because you are so down a rabbit hole of specialty. You don't see that pattern that connects anymore. And then, when I got all the way bent over and I mastered those three little areas, I started teaching students to do exactly the same thing. And that bothered me even more than the fact that I saw what I was doing as connected to the problems in the world. I was teaching the younger generation to do exactly the same thing. Now, contrast that with this emerging field of ecological design that's probably been gathering critical mass for the last, 30, 20, 10 to 15 years. The awareness within the traditional design disciplines is, that ecological design is some little sub-discipline of hippies that do kind of interesting things, maybe, but they usually look really ugly. Yeah. So you have all of these people collectively that have these attitudes towards each other, and wouldn't it be a whole lot better if we could just get them all working on the same page? Because the thing that isn't talked about very often is these folks are just churning out stuff all the time. Products, messages, materials that aren't going to return to the nutrient pool. We are cranking it out, and these people down here are more concerned with right fit and designing in resonance with natural systems. But what about the retrofit that is going to occupy so much of our time in the transition to a sustainable society? It's less about inventing new things than trying to retrofit and fix what doesn't work. And so pumping it out, and it's a deluge that can't be handled by this tiny little group of people down here that look at things in an entirely different way. And that often come from disciplines that are not within what you would consider the traditional design disciplines. And this has seemed to me to be such a problem. So what I've been doing increasingly is a refugee from this world, trying to learn from this world and then going back in to sort of the belly of the beast and talking to people within my own discipline about how we could begin to think differently. Because actually, I think there shouldn't be the distinctions of ecological design and traditional design. It should be design as a ubiquitous activity that everyone engages within. Some of us do it professionally, but that must be trans and interdisciplinary in order to create the solutions that are going to work in the world. So I think that this problem of disciplines is going to be, it needs to be tackled right along with all the other problems. Design is incredibly ubiquitous, and a colleague of mine at Carnegie Mellon, I think, has come up with a pretty good way to think about the ubiquity of design out there in the world. And he proposes that there are 4 domains of invention. And I've shown them in a nested way because I think at the core are signs and messages that are a direct expression of what we think. There's the design of all kinds of things and artifacts. Both of those usually exist within constellations of actions that are choreographed or designed. And within that, they all usually exist together within complex environments. Now, the thing that we always forget is all of that's nested within the context of the planet, or the region, or the place in which we live, and you can't forget that. So design is powerful and ubiquitous. It helps you to catch the right bus to work in the morning, or check the box to elect the wrong president. If anybody ever doubted that graphic design was not a powerful thing, this disproved that theory. We can thank a graphic designer for that. Developing a national democracy was a design problem, and so is the transition to a sustainable society. Birthday parties, weapons of mass destruction, peace treaties, airliners, paper clips, the atom bomb, bowling alleys, cereal boxes, your house and lazy boy recliner, Monopoly, Scrabble, and our iPods were all designed. Global warming, conversations, the current economic collapse, society, most cities, the internet, pollution and waste, riots, everyday life, and traffic jams are not. And yet design is implicated in all of those things. From its sheer ubiquity, design is implicated in most of the complex and pressing problems confronting us today. Victor Papanak said, "Design is the conscious and intuitive effort to impose meaningful order. It must be the bridge between human needs, culture, and the environment. But I think most of us would agree that that is not what it is today. So what's gone wrong? Why do humans design things that are toxic, ugly, and that often don't work very well? Why is it that we design unsustainably? That's at the core of my research question as I work on my own PhD. Why do we do it? Well, I think it's worldview. The root of the problem is worldview, the multiple strands of assumptions, beliefs, and paradigms that give rise to interconnected and interdependent actions, processes, and artifacts. It's much like the strands in a rope. It's very, very intertwined. And to think you can pull one strand out and solve that one problem when it's so inextricably connected to everything else is mechanistic thinking. It's reductionist. You have to understand the relationships between it and the whole. So this reductionist mechanistic worldview produces all kinds of strands of problems that connect to design. And you could structure an entire design curriculum on looking at some of these strands. All I'm going to do today is talk about a very few of these strands. Some of them include a limited view of the power and potential of design. And again, I speak from within the context of the traditional design disciplines. Most of us designers, I don't think, feel very empowered to get out there and make a difference. And I think that's largely because we work from so deep within a specialty that we either don't see the connections or we don't feel very empowered to make a big difference. The study of complexity theory actually gave me a heck of a lot of hope on that count. I also want to talk about the inability to see these interconnections and interdependencies, to think in terms of long horizons of time and connect the dots. I think we've got wrong-headed ideas about form giving. I mean, I've come to think of design as basically giving form to things. Design's inextricable relationship to the consumer marketplace. The confusion between wants and desires, and alienation from place and community, and finally, a lack of understanding of fit relationship between the planet, people, and the things we make and do. So first, let's look at worldview. The premise is what we think equals how and what we design. Very simple equation with very powerful ramifications. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Every nation and every man instantly surround themselves with material apparatus which corresponds exactly to their state of thought. Observe how every truth and every error, each a thought in some man's mind, clothes itself with societies, houses, cities, language, ceremonies, and newspapers. Observe the ideas of the present day and see how timber, brick, lime, and stone have flown into the convenient shape, obedient to the master idea reigning in the minds of many persons." And here's the important part. It follows, of course, that the least enlargement of ideas would cause the most striking changes of external things. So our worldview preconditions our perception of design problems within their context and causes us to focus on certain things while remaining blind to others. So I want you to pretend for a minute that reality is this image. It's called an ambiguous picture. Most of us are predisposed to see one of two images. How many people see an old woman? How many people see a young woman? Oh, isn't that interesting? I won't tell you what that means. That's like a worldview. You're predisposed to see one thing while you're blind to another. And the thing about this is we all have it, we're all embedded in it, and we're not conscious of what we're blind to, particularly designers. When we confront a context and we go to design something, we are bound to be blind to some things. So what are those? Mary Clark, in an excellent book called In Search of Human Nature, says, a worldview is a working model of reality that is a simplified hypothesis full of prejudice and custom that always allows us to walk across the room of life, yet will always remain a theory, partial and incomplete. So a worldview is always a subjective slice of reality that happens across time and culture. It's communal in scope, and it binds its adherents together in community. It's more like a vantage point that's very, very limited. It's an ongoing search for meaning in the domain of individual and collective concerns. Now, it's also this interpretive dialectical process that involves inner participation and interpretation through outer sense perception and experience, but it's always going back and forth between the subjective and the objective. So a worldview is descriptive in that it tells us what is. It's normative in that it tells us what ought to be. It's both a sketch of and blueprint for reality. So think about that. That's how we view the world. And yet we all sort of go around thinking it is what it is out there, when in reality it is only what we think it is out there. So I just want to talk about the anatomy of these things. This is an entirely reductionist way to think about it, but sometimes we have to do that in order to understand it. Think of worldview as a master perspective that is comprised of multiple paradigms that we subscribe to, a couple of which usually hold sway. You know, we all know people who subscribe to the traditional scientific paradigm, and if you can't prove it, if it's not tangible, then it isn't so. For others, it's the religious paradigm. You know, what God wants me to do is what I'm going to do, and that completely colors my worldview and everything about it. And for me, for a long time, it was probably the design paradigm. I saw everything through the dominance of what that design paradigm told me I should do, what questions I could ask, etc. Paradigms prescribe behavior and guide the questions that can and cannot be asked, and the traditional design disciplines have their own dominant paradigm. Every discipline does. So if we took one person's worldview, we're all so different. You could begin to say, what are the paradigms that hold sway within my worldview? Design always arises out of these. It always does. I give my students an exercise to take designed objects or designed processes or things and have them break down what the worldviews or paradigms were that they emerged out of. So, you know, belief in democracy and the science split the atom. You know, could you have had the atom bomb if there wasn't a worldview or a paradigm out of which those emerged? So you see where I'm going with this. It's all about developing more conscious awareness of the way we think and what we may be blind to as we begin to frame design problems in their context. You know, you're never going to crack this. It's a story that we tell ourselves. But what I'm trying to get my students to do and what I try to get myself to do is what are the assumptions and beliefs that I bring to anything I design that I normally wouldn't be aware of. Worldviews are always paradoxical in that they're full of incoherence, contradiction, and amazingly lots of certainty. Because we just believe that what we see is what is. So think about that. That image sums it all up. How could somebody do that? But we all have these paradigms that are either complementary or contradictory. Worldviews, though a lifetime in the making, can change in a moment via an epiphany, which is illustrated in the iconic figure of Scrooge from Dickens' Christmas Carol. His entire worldview undergoes a radical change in the course of one long, scary night. But the thing that fascinates me about this is how this idea of an epiphany is an archetype. We all sort of accept that that might be possible. you have a breakdown, or there's some deep incoherence in your worldview that triggers a crisis of some type, and you have an epiphany. You know, I had one myself, which is what led me to sort of change the way I was designing at great expense and lots of pain in certain areas of my life. But we do have these, or we know someone that has had them. Systems theorist Donella Meadows, in a famous article entitled Places to Intervene in a System, identified 9 leverage points for change within complex open systems. And what do you think she argued was the most important, most powerful leverage point there is? Mindset. She called mindset the shared idea in the minds of society, the great big unstated assumptions, unstated because it's unnecessary to state them, everybody always knows them. They constitute that society's paradigm or deepest set of beliefs about how and who they are and how the world works. So within the American mindset, we've got a few deep-seated ones, and then we have our own at the individual level. Western paradigmatic assumptions that have utterly dumbfounded other cultures include money measures something real and has real meaning, therefore those who are paid less are worth less. Growth is always good. Nature is a stock of resources to be converted to human purposes, and one can actually own land. Well, to some cultures that just seems like the world upside down. So assumptions such as these are part of our collective worldview and utterly control how and what we design. Our dominant Western worldview causes us to focus on parts, not wholes, separate objects instead of the relationships between them, short-term linear causal effects rather than cycles of renewal over long periods of time. We see the world, in short, as a collection of objects as opposed to a communion of subjects, as Brian Swim has said. But the point is, because we see the world that way, we design that way. So design can be thought of as the physical embodiment of a worldview. And if you really start examining the things we design, with that in mind, you can see the wacky reasoning that is behind any one of these. This is a toilet seat. It has real starfish and shells embedded in the resin. You know, that sucker is not going to degrade in our lifetime. And it's probably not going to be useful for more than a year or two. So there's a pathological contradiction embedded in that design. I mean, could we do a whole thesis on this? What? Yeah, what can you say? What can you say? I mean, this is, I've done a whole lecture on this. Like, war that becomes video game. My nephew grew up as we were invading Iraq, and he played the video games based on real sorties and missions for his entire adolescence, and guess what he's gone into now at university? He's going to be a games designer. Now, I'm waiting to see what kind of games he designs. So take a really simple design assignment like design a lamp. Now, this is the illustrious director of the Design Council, or the Design Museum in the UK. And he was asked in a competition sponsored by the Independent magazine to pick what he thought was the most meaningful design of the 21st century. And this is what he chose. Yeah, it retails for $1,200. And he's taking it very seriously. Now, in contrast is this light that was designed by KVA Architecture, which is solar-powered and designed to deliver decentralized power and light to the developing world as a non-profit enterprise. This thing is amazing. You know, it folds up, it stores up light during the day, and can be used in a myriad of ways at night. So my point is, good design depends more on your more than your point of view. It depends upon your worldview. And a fragmented, reductionist worldview gives rise to ill-conceived, fragmented forms and fragmented disciplines comprised of separate and often unrelated domains of specialty. This goes back to what I was talking about before. And each one of those domains has their own processes, their own vocabulary that becomes like a Tower of Babel, where if you really want to collaborate, it's very, very difficult because you've got no common language or fundamental belief system upon which to base collaboration. So I think a lot of this begs for a bigger definition of what design is, to transcend these discipline structures or silos that we all live in spite of today. And I really like this definition that I think is David Orr's, and I've had a devil of a time trying to find where it came from. Maybe it's yours, John, I'm not sure. I cannot track it down. It's the shaping of flows of energy and matter to meet human concern, hopefully without compromising the ability of other species to meet theirs. Now, to me, you cannot have a definition like this within the reductionist holistic worldview. It must arise out of a holistic worldview, because the shaping of flows, to me, implies process in time and strands of relationship. When you talk of energy and matter, it means everything derives from the same source, the earth, and will ultimately have to return to it. To meet human concerns has to do with design based upon genuine need and not wants and desires. And finally, if you tag on that pesky little footnote that you can't design without compromising the ability of other species to meet theirs, most design created within the traditional design discipline is going to fail the test. It just won't pass. And that's more about deep ecology and the belief that humans are no more or less important than any other species on the planet. And that's a big stretch. When I do lectures at design schools and I say that, not only do I have people shaking their head, but they get downright hostile. Really hostile. So another strand is our inability to see interconnections and interdependencies, relationship, and wrong-headed ideas about form giving. So design forms are conceived as static and unrelated objects, and their quick and profitable realization is the focus of the design process. And of course, that process is inextricably embedded within our dominant economic paradigm. Form in the natural world is based upon tight webs of relationship and holarchic structure. So I think we all look at something like this and we go, well, yeah, of course it's all related. At varying levels of scale, we know this. But what if I were to suggest that the forms we bring forth ought to have the same kind of relationship? It seems crazy, seems insane. How is that possible? They're conglomerations of separate, fragmented things that usually have to coexist because we say they do, but they never do very well. So one of the questions I'm putting to my students is, what if we had to conceive of relationship between all of these things, much as relationships exist in an ecosystem? Designers would be paralyzed. Traditional designers would be paralyzed. All forms derive from a single source, the earth, and are therefore bound together through relationship. Seeing and designing for that relationship is fundamental to ecological design. Gregory Bateson said, "What pattern connects the crab to the lobster and the orchid to the primrose, and all four of them to me, and me to you, and all six of us to the amoeba in one direction and to the backward schizophrenic in another?" And in his book, The Turning Point, Fritjof Capra calls our culture's inability to see the interconnections and interdependencies between global problems a crisis in perception, or an outdated worldview that can no longer cope with the problems we face. So ecological design must be designed for interconnections or relationship. Designers must learn to connect the dots between their designs and what I think of as the strands of consequence that ripple out from them. So what is the pattern that connects all of the big problems that face us today? And then what, in turn, connects design to those problems? Because as I tell my students, we need to learn to work backwards to see what it is we're doing that leads to this in order to come back and design it differently. So this is an exercise I give them. I say, take the daily newspaper and pick one article or one ad, and I want you to connect the dots or look for those strands of consequence that ripple out from it. And here we've got an ad for a cell phone. You know, intended to meet the need for communication, but quickly morphing into a fashion accessory. But you can look at the strands of consequence, you know. They have a very short life cycle. They break down. We ship all of the garbage to Asia, which is very convenient. And then people go about the very dysfunctional task of trying to take it apart and strip away what is usable. It's not designed for disassembly. This really says it all. Designed for desire. Now, this is my culture in spades. I was in branding for many years. I could tell you stories that would curl your hair. But that's what we're doing. This is a worldview right here, designed for desire. You know, we all know this. But the point is, everybody in this room probably knows this, but the people that are pumping this out and pumping this out don't even think about it. They don't even think about the strands of consequence that ripple out. Now, just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, mobile phones are now being taken up by haute couture as the essential accessory that must be designed. So what does this mean? It means that something that is designed as a permanent artifact is now becoming a fashion accessory with ever shorter lifespans, but the way in which they're being made doesn't change at all. So what is the pattern that connects all of the big problems that face us today, and then what in turn connects design to those problems? Because as I tell my students, we need to learn to work backwards to see what it is we're doing that leads to this in order to come back and design it differently. So this is an exercise I give them. I say, take the daily newspaper and pick one article or one ad, and I want you to connect the dots or look for those strands of consequence that ripple out from it. And here we've got an ad for a cell phone. You know, intended to meet the need for communication, but quickly morphing into a fashion accessory. But you can look at the strands of consequence, you know. They have a very short life cycle. They break down. We ship all of the garbage to Asia, which is very convenient. And then people go about the very dysfunctional task of trying to take it apart and strip away what is usable. It's not designed for disassembly. This really says it all. Designed for desire. Now, this is my culture in spades. I was in branding for many years. I could tell you stories that would curl your hair. But that's what we're doing. This is a worldview right here, designed for desire. You know, we all know this. But the point is, everybody in this room probably knows this, but the people that are pumping this out and pumping this out don't even think about it. They don't even think about the strands of consequence that ripple out. Now, just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, mobile phones are now being taken up by haute couture as the essential accessory that must be designed. So what does this mean? It means that something that is designed as a permanent artifact is now becoming a fashion accessory with ever shorter lifespans, but the way in which they're being made doesn't change at all. So it's becoming an ephemeral object made from permanent materials that don't want to return to the nutrient pool. And once again, what is it in the mindset that lets us do that? So what if designers had to follow one simple rule as part of their design brief? Waste equals food. What if our relationship to the forms we created had to include their demise? So the design process, I argue, is usually based on the most quick and efficient and profitable way to get from point A to B. I ran a design firm for more than a decade, and I knew that I had to generate X amount hundreds of thousands of dollars a month to keep the doors open, and believe me, there was a pressure to get from point A to B as quickly as I could. But what I've tried to do here is map our relationship to our idea, because it gets ever weaker. The further we get from that first idea we have, we love it. Oh my God, I've got this idea for an amazing cell phone. So what we're really focused on is this. And we forget about everything in between. Because the minute it goes from a thought in your head to something real in the world, the resources come out of the planet. Somewhere, somehow. And we don't think about it in those terms. So we completely leap over that and go, well, my sketch, it needs to be prototyped. Oh, testing, yeah, we got to test it. Product designers are a little more focused on how it gets manufactured, but only so that it's a, really accurate reproduction of what they want. But here's the point right here. This is the point. That, we're not thinking about that. So we go from concept to sketch to prototype, testing, manufacture, and then the holy grail of the final thing. That's pretty much where our relationship ends, but there is a little agenda behind that for most of us. Oh yeah, our portfolio piece and the awards we might win. Now, this is not the culture of ecological design, but it is very much the culture of traditional design. So those of us that are working within the ecological design disciplines, I think, need to understand what the mindset is that is pumping all this stuff out every day, all the time, because we're going to have to deal with it. To mitigate it or retrofit it or try and stem the tide somehow. I think that is part of the transition to a sustainable society. So once again, there's the end of the relationship. I got it in the portfolio. I'm happy. I'm done. So designers focus on static forms loosely related to each other, but not the greater context, the nutrient pool out of which they arose. We're interested in the sexy product, the brand image, the sumptuous packaging. Now, I'm picking here on product designers, graphic designers, and packaging designers, but no one's exempt. The tendency to view the things we design out of context in ignorance of the web of relationships they're embedded in is typical of most of the disciplines. The fashion and textile industry has given us a crocodile bag with pavé diamonds. They're retails for $220,000. Here we have a golf course in the middle of the desert. Yeah. And here we have the Getty Center in Los Angeles, which I actually worked on this project. It took 14 years to build, and the entire building is clad in travertine marble that was quarried outside Rome and shipped halfway around the world. And that's only one facet of that project I could tell you stories about. So Christopher Williams says that the world we know is a whole and all its parts respond to the same earthly laws. All substance about us has the same physiochemical basis. All particles of matter are molded by the same physical laws. The structural unity is the same. So the environment bookends everything. It bookends everything. So our wrong-headed notion about form, I think, is that we forget that basic law. The universal cycle from which no form is exempt. Birth, maturation and aging, death and decay. So I was lecturing last night in Cami and Diane's class, and I was like, we kind of know that we are subject to that, because you get up in the morning and you look in the mirror and you go, wow, that wasn't there yesterday. That wrinkle wasn't there. So we kind of witness our own return to the nutrient pool, but I don't think we think about it in terms of what we make. This is on a journey to the nutrient pool right now, but it's happening so slowly, we don't think about that. We don't see this as process in time. We see it as a static form. So my point is, what if designers had to think about form as process in time in the design brief as they're designing? Because, it's a thing. It's kind of ugly. Looks worse as it gets older. We don't know how to design so that things look better with age. And in fact, we're in denial about age altogether. You know, all I have to do is go to the newsstand and look at all of these women who were born the same year as I am, and they're airbrushed to perfection. I am fascinated with our culture's denial of the aging process, which applies to us and the things we make. Look at this table. That's not looking better as it gets older. But why? Humans used to design so that things did look better as they got older. So ecological design is based upon an understanding that form is fluid process in time. All form arises from the same nutrient pool and must safely and gracefully return to it. So a designer's relationship to form must last for the whole cycle. That's got to be embedded in the design brief. We design in linear cradle-to-grave process, as McDonough and Braungart have said. You conceive it straight into the landfill. There it goes. So if we take this simple premise, waste equals food, gosh, most everything there was designed by somebody, and look where it ended up. We're just not thinking. So the Zero Emissions Research Institute has this thing called a giee cluster, which a lot of you are probably aware of. Now, the interesting thing about this for me is this is a web, a designed web in which the waste from one industry equals food for another. So this is that design in practice. And what I say to my students is, what if everything you had to design had to be embedded in a web like this? What if you had to take the waste from another industry or a couple of industries in order to find the raw material to make what it is you have to make? Well, it would be really tough at first. But given what humans have accomplished, it seems to me that if we turned our attention onto that, surely we could do better than we're doing now. So the relationship between what we design and the strands of consequence that ripple out from it. So then there's design's inextricable relationship with the consumer marketplace and our confusion between wants and desires. Design and its inextricable relationship. Have you noticed that our shopping centers are starting to look like cathedrals? You know, I'm starting to collect these pictures. It's really amazing. They're big and they sort of are awe-inspiring. I mean, there's a whole thesis there as well. So needs are finite, they're universal, they're often best fulfilled within community in place-specific ways. Desires are infinite, they're individual, they're fulfilled in the consumer marketplace, and I would argue they arise from a pathology of unmet needs and alienation from both community and place. So most of the students that I have taught over the last 20 years don't have an option to ply their trade outside the consumer marketplace. That's where most of the jobs for them are. And by the time they graduate, they have loans of $50,000 that they have to pay off. So they have to get the highest paying job they possibly can. And guess what? Then there's no wiggle room for morals and ethics. They just have to get on that conveyor belt and they don't get off again. But this is what much of the traditional design disciplines are working for. It's the design for desire ad that I showed you before. So needs are biological, psychological, and sociocultural, and they include things like subsistence, protection, affection, understanding, participation, creation, and leisure. Much of what we think is satisfying those needs is actually satisfying desires. So Victor Margolin said that design must disengage itself from the consumer culture as the primary shaper of its identity and find a terrain where it can begin to rethink its role in the world. The result of this activity, if successful, will be a new power for the designer to participate in projects for the welfare of humankind, both inside and outside the market economy. So only a few generations ago, Van der Ren and Cowan contend, it would have been absurd to suggest that one should design and build in ways that did not reflect the local climate, materials, landforms, and customs. the design of human habitat was limited to local resources, abilities, and ways of doing things. That's not any longer the case. In the book, The Clock of the Long Now, Stuart Brand proposes that there are 6 levels to a healthy civilization and that they all move in successively at a slower pace the further down that you go. So at the top layer, you have fashion and art, which is quick, irreverent, engaging, and it drives the energy for commerce. Commerce takes the good ideas from above and informs the levels below. Infrastructure includes things like education, science, medicine, transportation, and it must be supported by governance and culture because the payback period is too long. Governance tempers the fast-moving layers above and creates checks and balances. NGOs operate at that level. Now, this is what is interesting to me. I think what we often think of culture as is this. But he actually contends that culture only changes at the pace of language and religion. And then, of course, the slowest moving layer of all and the most powerful is nature, or the environment. Now, the problem today, he argues, is that the top layers, empowered by technology and an economic paradigm predicated upon financial profit and unbridled growth, are now impacting the lower levels, which are much slower to regenerate and heal. So, one of the things I'm looking at in my research is early design operated, I think, at the pace of culture. Designers were users, so knowledge and experience accrued over decades, and it was passed on through generations. Craft and trade traditions originated here, and because design originated from a level close to nature, it was sustainable and in harmony with nature. It was designed for need. It was useful and appropriate. But now, even in the course of my career, I've seen it moving up and up to where design is for these fast-paced levels, and it's not informed by a history of knowledge and experience, and it becomes ever more alienated from place. And because it's underpinned by powerful technologies, it has the ability to impact these lower levels very quickly. And ethics are largely devoid. If it's possible, then it's viable. So I want to talk now about alienation from community and place and how it's affected how and what we design. In his book Notes on the Synthesis of Form, Christopher Alexander distinguished between what he calls unselfconscious and self-conscious cultures, and he compared the form-giving capabilities of each. So in an unconscious culture, little thought was given to form-giving. They believed in a right and wrong way to make something. There were no general theories or written records to guide fabrication because the knowledge was passed on. So therefore, there was little specialization and division of labor. There was little market, on the other hand, for inventiveness and innovation. Form giving was born of necessity. The form giver is often the user, and there weren't stocks of inventories for profit. Things were made as needed. Well, almost the opposite is true today. Design is a separate and specialized process. There are multiple ways to design something. It's usually based on the experience and the knowledge accrued over one person's career. And technology allows us to realize it very quickly. And forms are mostly made for profit as opposed to need. So this is a great illustration, I think, of that. The city here has grown up in a very organic way, much like an organism, over time and appropriate to the place that it's in. And what's at the heart of this is a pedestrian square that would serve as for the center, for the community. Okay, over here. This is Sun City, Arizona, where my dad lived. I've been here many times, and in fact, just a month ago, I was driving through all of these streets. This is a city that was conceived and realized in a matter of months, just imposed. Emergent design, imposed design. This was built and developed irrespective of place. This is in the middle of the Arizona desert, and I want you to notice what surrounds this. Golf courses. Golf courses. They have to water these things for hours every evening. They can't do it during the day because the water evaporates in 110-degree heat. So you can drive all over Sun City at night and you just hear the constant hum of sprinklers watering the lawns of everybody. Each one of these houses has a huge air conditioning unit on top of it that has to run all day long, and you won't see a soul outside because it's too hot for people to be outside. Look at what's at the heart of this community. A parking lot with a strip mall. So, again, you could do an entire thesis just looking at that. You know, diverse form rooted in place, or homogeneous form imposed upon a place irrespective of local conditions. Same thing with artifacts. This one still shows some hints and vestiges of the place and the time that it arose out of. I bet you most of us, if you travel anywhere in the world, you will see this chair. This chair is everywhere. I've seen it in Bali, I've seen it in Thailand, I've seen it everywhere. It retails for about $10 in the UK. They're pumping out this chair all over the planet, and it ends up here. That's where it ends up. Along with so many other things that somebody sketched and said, aha, that's it. And it's made in a way that will not return to the nutrient pool. So I think this alienation from place has led to a huge homogenation of form. And any of us that travel, you see it. Things are looking more and more the same no matter where you go on the planet. And that, in turn, I think, reinforces the loss of community and alienation of place. It's a cycle. It's like a pathological cycle that we're involved in. And these pictures are literally from all over the world. And they look scarily familiar to us, to the point where I don't think we even see it anymore. In an amazing book called Timeless Beauty, the author John Lane contends that we've become immune to ugliness. And that's one of the great tragedies of our age. So rootedness in place is the most important and least recognized need of the human soul, Simone Weil believed. This is a slide from the movie THX 1138. It was the first full-length film that George Lucas ever did. And it was the story of humanity on a polluted earth that has to go underground to live. And in order to survive underground, human bonding and sexuality had to be chemically suppressed. So for him, the realization of this nightmare in a dystopian future was utter placelessness. When people violated the law, which was usually going off your medication, you were sent to a placeless place that was patrolled by faceless robots. So I find this fascinating that one of the great storytellers of our age thought that the worst thing imaginable was placelessness and absolute loss of community. So ecological design is place-based design. It's appropriate to local conditions. It reflects or embodies a healthy social order. It achieves a marriage of beauty, utility, and sustainability. So structures and artifacts are emergent forms that arise as the result of people living sustainably in place. They're useful, healthful, and meaningful. This is a great example in Christopher Alexander's notes on the synthesis of form, the Moscom hut in Cameroon. And there is meaning woven into every facet of that design. It reflects the social order. It's sustainable. It has dual meaning in that the form arises out of its need to be repaired and serviced in a certain way. Similar to these Inuit snow goggles made out of materials that were available to them. Highly useful. The slit prevented snow blindness, but also increased the acuity of vision over very long distances. Gracefully returns to the nutrient pool. And this fascinates me. I've been reading about the Mbuti pygmies lately. So they have this way of building huts that is simply, they're withy branches that are tied at the top. The woman builds the hut, and then she covers the whole thing with these very large leaves in the rainforest. But the way she situates the hut in relation to the 7, 8, or 8 other families in the hunting band completely reflects the social harmony within the group. Now, the band will move every month, and how the huts are picked up, moved, and situated tells you exactly who's arguing and how they're arguing, and it's completely reflected in the physical form and the place. So this is the evolution of this band over the course of a calendar year. If the woman is a little displeased with her neighbor, she simply heels up the door and moves it away from the offending party. Now, the Mbuti are raised to prize cooperation and calm over everything else. So the minute that the band sees that a door has been oriented away from its neighbor, they all feel compelled to take responsibility for healing that breach. So they don't have to yell, they don't have to fight. It's this very subtle signature in behavior and physical form that signals there's a rift that needs to be healed. And look at the way that this is changing, just like a physical organism. It's fascinating to me. So in the summertime, they had a lot more people join the camp. But then look at how it goes through its little morphs until the end of the year. It took a year for the tensions to be healed, but they were healed with a minimum of upset, because cooperation, they're dependent on cooperating with each other for the hunt. So I think that this is such a great example of marriage, of place, community, and form, how the artifacts arise out of the meaning between those relationships. So what is it that we need to understand about a design process that gave rise to artifacts and structures such as these and the examples before? Artifacts and structures that were unique and appropriate to their time and place. And finally, an understanding of fit relationship between planet, people, and the things we make and do. So many indigenous cultures were characterized by healthy, sustainable interactions between people, the environment, and the things they did and made. It's this important triad that is at the heart of a sustainable society. But of course, it doesn't exist the way I've drawn it here. It's actually, at the center is a more ecological worldview. But these relationships are nested. We need to well, I'm going to skip that. So first of all, we have context. And our context is always the place we're in and the planet as the greater whole. Then there's community, which in many ways you could say, well, all our problems begin and end here. You know, it begins with how we look at this, and then it depends on what we make and how we behave. So at the crux of this, I think, is design for need, an ecological design, with a complete awareness of the other domains that that's nested within. So what I've been doing in my research is trying to figure out how a design curriculum might be rethought to accommodate a different kind of design. And I think the way we're doing it now is the wrong way. You start out specializing, and there's no common ground or worldview or language that we share that allows us to collaborate very well. So I actually think looking and addressing worldview at some level, and then making eco-literacy a central part of every designer's education, and that could be said probably for every discipline there is out there. Looking at how people relate to nature, the natural world, the place they live in, and the people that they're there with. And then finally, thinking about what it is we make in the world. From there, I think, you've got a platform to then begin to specialize. So I think the whole system, in a way, needs to be turned on its head. Designers, I think, need to examine the underlying beliefs and assumptions or worldview that utterly controls how we think about design as well as how we choose to design. This implies a shift from reductionist thinking to systems thinking, connecting the dots and thinking in terms of relationship, interdependency, and long horizons of time. Understanding that good or appropriate design is always place-based design, And fundamental to such understanding are healthy relationships between people, the planet, and the things that they make. Designers need to fundamentally change the way in which we think about form, from static and unrelated objects to fluid and temporal strands of relationship. We need to take responsibility for the appropriate coming into being of form and its inevitable and graceful return to the nutrient pool. The principle of waste equals food should be at the heart of every design brief. And shift from the current model of design as an individual and specialized activity to a multidisciplinary, collaborative activity that's rooted in both community and place. Christopher Alexander said, when you build a thing, you cannot merely build that thing in isolation, but must also repair the world around it and within it, so that the larger world, that one place, becomes more coherent and more whole. And that thing which you make takes its place in the web of nature as you make it. That's it. Thank you.